The photograph arrived in a manila envelope with no return address, just a postmark from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, dated 3 weeks earlier than the day it reached my mailbox in late October. Inside was a black and white image from 1962, showing my grandfather standing in front of a white clapboard house I had never seen before, his arm around a woman who was not my grandmother, and 2 children at their feet who bore an unmistakable resemblance to my father. The handwriting on the back read only, Nash Street, summer 1962, and beneath that, in different ink, someone had added, "Ask your father about Franklin." My grandfather died in 1989, my grandmother followed in 2003, and my father had always told me he was an only child raised in the tobacco fields outside Rocky Mount, where 3 generations of our family had worked the same land since before the Depression. The envelope contained nothing else, no letter of explanation, no phone number to call, just that single photograph that seemed to split my understanding of family history down the middle, like a wedge driven into seasoned wood. I held it under the kitchen light for 20 minutes, studying every detail, the cut of my grandfather's work shirt, the architectural style of that unfamiliar house, the way the children smiled up at him with the easy comfort of kids who knew their father's routines and moods. My grandfather's face in that picture looked younger than I remembered him, his shoulders less stooped, his expression carrying none of the weariness that had marked his final years when I knew him as a quiet man who kept his secrets buried deeper than the tobacco roots he'd spent a lifetime pulling from Carolina soil. I called my father that night, asked him if the name Franklin meant anything beyond the county where we'd always lived, and the silence that followed told me more than any words could have about the weight of things kept hidden for 60 years. Rocky Mount sits where Nash County and Edgecombe County meet along the Tar River, a town that has always existed in a state of geographic split, half its streets belonging to one county and half to another, its identity divided by an accident of surveying that happened before the Civil War. The downtown stretched along the river with its brick tobacco warehouses and empty storefronts, places where my grandfather used to bring my father on Saturday mornings to watch the auction houses fill with the season's crop, where men spoke in the rapid-fire chant of tobacco auctioneering and money changed hands based on the color and moisture content of leaves that had been someone's entire year of labor. By the time I started visiting Rocky Mount to search for answers about that photograph, most of those warehouses stood vacant, their windows broken and their loading docks overtaken by kudzu, monuments to an economy that had collapsed when the cigarette companies moved their buying operations overseas. The town felt suspended between eras, its streets lined with houses that hadn't changed since my grandfather's time, their front porches sagging under the weight of decades, their yard furniture rusting in the humid air that rolled up from the river every evening and settled over everything like a physical presence. If you want to follow this investigation to its end and discover what really happened on Nash Street in 1962, subscribe now because the next piece of evidence will change everything we think we know about how families keep their darkest secrets. I started at the county clerk's office in Nashville, the Nash County seat, requesting property records for Nash Street addresses from the 1960s, and the woman behind the counter looked at me with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what kind of search I was conducting. She brought out deed books bound in cracked leather, their pages yellowed and fragile, filled with handwritten entries that documented every property transfer in that part of town from 1945 onward, and I spent 3 hours turning those pages before I found what I was looking for. A house at 428 Nash Street had been purchased in August 1959 by James Edward Morrison, my grandfather's full legal name, paid for in cash according to the notation, no mortgage recorded, and the property had remained in his name until May 1963, when it was transferred to a woman named Catherine Ann Pruitt. The address on the transfer document listed Catherine Pruitt as a resident of that same Nash Street house, and beneath her signature was a notation I had to read 3 times before its meaning settled into my understanding. Guardian for minor children, Franklin James Morrison and Elizabeth Catherine Morrison, ages 7 and 5. The main street of Rocky Mount still carried the architectural bones of the 1950s, with its Art Deco movie theater and its corner drugstore that had operated continuously since 1923, serving egg creams and grilled cheese sandwiches to 3 generations of local families who had watched the town's fortunes rise and fall with the tobacco market. The neighborhood spread out from downtown in concentric rings that marked different eras of expansion. The Victorian homes near the center giving way to the craftsman bungalows of the 1920s, and then to the ranch houses that proliferated after World War II when returning veterans used their VA loans to claim a piece of the American dream in towns like this one across the South. Nash Street belonged to that post-war wave, a working-class neighborhood where men who labored in the tobacco warehouses and furniture factories could afford modest homes on quarter-acre lots, where children rode bicycles in the street until the streetlights came on, and mothers hung laundry in backyards shaded by pecan trees that had been planted when the subdivisions were first platted. My grandfather would have driven these streets 4 times a week in the early 1960s, traveling from the Leggett Road farm, where my grandmother waited with my father, to this other neighborhood, where another family lived their lives, in the spaces between his official existence, and I tried to imagine what thoughts occupied his mind during those 8-mile journeys between his 2 separate worlds. The Historical Society occupied a converted train depot on the east side of town, its archives filled with boxes of photographs and documents that volunteers had been organizing for 20 years without ever quite finishing the task. A woman named Margaret Sykes ran the place, a retired librarian in her 80s who had lived in Rocky Mount her entire life, and who possessed the kind of institutional memory that comes from paying attention to local events and gossip for 7 decades. When I showed her the photograph and explained what I was looking for, she disappeared into the back room for 15 minutes and returned with a folder containing newspaper clippings about tobacco industry social events from the 1960s, garden club meetings and church suppers and company picnics, where the same names appeared over and over in the photo captions. My grandfather appeared in 3 of those images, always standing at the edge of group shots, never quite integrated into the social fabric of the events he was attending. And Margaret said she remembered him as a man who kept to himself in ways that people found slightly odd but not concerning, since tobacco work attracted solitary types who preferred the company of plants and numbers to the complicated dynamics of human relationship. I asked Margaret if she had ever heard rumors about my grandfather maintaining 2 households, and she studied me for a long moment before answering that in a town like Rocky Mount during the 1960s, people heard many things, but spoke about very few of them, especially when the subjects involved were white men of some standing in the community. She said there had been whispers about James Morrison and a woman who lived on Nash Street, but those whispers had never cohered into anything definite enough to be called public knowledge, and after Catherine Pruitt's death in 1974, the talk had faded away into the background noise of small-town speculation that never quite rose to the level of confirmed fact. Margaret pulled out a city directory from 1965 and showed me the listings for both of my grandfather's addresses, the Leggett Road farm listed under his name with my grandmother Helen as spouse, and the Nash Street house listed under Catherine Pruitt, with no spouse indicated but with the notation, 2 children, ages 10 and 8, in the household composition column. The directory made it clear that anyone who wanted to know about the arrangement could have found the information easily. But apparently no one had wanted to know badly enough to ask the questions that would have brought the truth into the open, where it would have damaged reputations and disrupted the social order that everyone had invested in maintaining. The clerk watched me photograph those pages with my phone, her silence heavy with unspoken knowledge. And when I asked if she remembered anyone named Catherine Pruitt, she shook her head slowly and said only that some stories in Rocky Mount went back farther than official records could reach. I drove to Nash Street that afternoon, a neighborhood of modest frame houses built in the post-war years when tobacco money still flowed through Nash County and men like my grandfather could afford to maintain 2 separate households just 8 miles apart. The house at 428 still stood, its white paint now gray and peeling, its front porch enclosed with aluminum windows that hadn't existed in 1962, and an elderly man was working in the yard next door, trimming hedges with the methodical patience of someone who had performed the same task for decades. When I showed him the photograph and asked if he remembered the people who had lived in that house 60 years ago, his pruning shears went still, and his face took on the careful neutrality of someone who had learned long ago that some questions were better left unanswered in small southern towns, where everyone's history was entangled with everyone else's. He studied the photograph for a long moment, then handed it back, and said he'd moved to that street in 1965, 3 years after the picture was taken. But he remembered Catherine Pruitt as a quiet woman who kept to herself, raised her 2 children alone, and died in a car accident in 1974 when those kids were still teenagers. The children had gone to live with relatives in Wilson County after that, he said, and he hadn't heard their names spoken in decades, though he remembered the boy Franklin used to mow lawns in the neighborhood, and the girl Elizabeth had a talent for singing that everyone said could have taken her somewhere beyond Rocky Mount if circumstances had been different. I asked if anyone had ever mentioned my grandfather's connection to that family, and the old man's expression shifted into something that resembled sadness mixed with resignation, the look of someone who had watched secrets erode the foundations of too many families over the years. He said that in 1962, in a town like Rocky Mount, where racial segregation was still enforced by law and social codes ran even deeper than legal ones, a man could maintain 2 separate families if he had enough money and determination, especially if those families existed in different parts of town and moved in different circles that never intersected except in the most carefully controlled ways. The tobacco auction house where my grandfather had worked for 40 years still stood on Falls Road, though its interior had been converted into climate-controlled storage units where people kept belongings they couldn't fit into their shrinking lives. I found the building's owner through a property management company, an older man named Dutch Hardison, who had worked alongside my grandfather in the 1960s, and remembered him as a man of rigid routine who arrived before dawn and left after dark 6 days a week during auction season. Dutch invited me to his house in the Sunset Park neighborhood, a brick ranch with a screened porch where we sat drinking sweet tea while he told me stories about tobacco culture that felt like they belonged to a different country rather than just a different era. He remembered my grandfather as someone who never socialized with the other workers, never attended the poker games or weekend barbecues, never spoke about his life outside the auction house except in the most general terms about weather and crop yields. That reserve had seemed unremarkable at the time, Dutch said, because tobacco men were often solitary by nature, their work requiring a focus that left little energy for casual friendship. But looking back through the lens of what I now knew about the Nash Street house, that isolation took on a different character entirely. Dutch had never heard of Catherine Pruitt, but when I mentioned the children's names from the property records, his expression changed, and he asked me to wait while he retrieved something from inside the house. He returned carrying a cardboard box filled with papers from the auction house, employment records and payroll documents that the company had been preparing to destroy when it closed in 1995. Materials Dutch had saved because he thought someone might want them for local history someday. Among those papers was a life insurance policy application from 1961, a standard benefit the auction house offered to all employees, and my grandfather had listed 2 beneficiaries in equal shares, my grandmother, Helen Morrison, with an address on the Leggett Road farm where I knew my father had grown up, and Catherine Ann Pruitt with the Nash Street address I had already found in the property records. The policy had been in effect until my grandfather's death in 1989, Dutch said, which meant Catherine must have died before him and her share would have reverted to my grandmother, or perhaps to the children she'd left behind, depending on how the legal language was written, and whether anyone had bothered to update the beneficiary information after 1974. I spent the next week in the Rocky Mount Public Library, going through newspaper archives on microfilm, scrolling past advertisements for tobacco products and segregationist political campaigns, searching for any mention of Catherine Pruitt or the car accident that had killed her. The obituary I finally found ran in the October 17, 1974 edition of the Rocky Mount Telegram, a brief notice that said, Catherine Ann Pruitt, age 46, had died October 14th in a single-vehicle accident on Highway 301 near the Edgecombe County line, survived by her children, Franklin James Morrison and Elizabeth Catherine Morrison. Services to be held at Cornerstone Baptist Church, with burial at Pineview Cemetery. The Morrison surname in that obituary confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that my grandfather had not only maintained 2 families, but had given his second set of children his own last name, an act of acknowledgement that seemed to contradict the secrecy surrounding their existence. I found Franklin Morrison's name in the 1975 Rocky Mount High School yearbook, a junior that year with a serious expression in his class photo, and Elizabeth Morrison appeared as a freshman, her resemblance to my father so striking that anyone who knew our family would have recognized the connection immediately if they had thought to look. The cemetery records at Pineview showed Catherine Pruitt buried in a plot purchased by James Morrison in 1974, paid for in cash, just like the Nash Street house had been 15 years earlier, and beside her grave were 2 empty plots that had never been used, spaces reserved for a future that never materialized the way someone had planned. I stood at that gravesite on a cold November morning, while wind stripped the last leaves from the oak trees overhead, reading the simple inscription, "Beloved Mother," and wondering what conversations had passed between my grandfather and this woman, whose existence had been erased from every family story I'd ever heard. The groundskeeper, a man in his 70s who had worked at Pineview since the 1960s, remembered the funeral as a small affair, maybe a dozen people, no elaborate flowers or lengthy service, just a quiet burial on a Thursday afternoon when most people in Rocky Mount were at work or school. He remembered my grandfather standing at the graveside long after everyone else had left, and he remembered thinking at the time that the man's grief seemed heavier than what you'd expect for a distant relative or casual friend, the kind of sorrow that suggested a connection deeper than what the public record would show. I hired a private investigator in Wilson County to locate Franklin and Elizabeth Morrison, and within 3 days she called me back with addresses in different states, Franklin living in Tennessee and Elizabeth in South Carolina, both of them married with children of their own, both of them having left North Carolina decades ago and never returned, except for occasional holidays. The investigator asked if I wanted her to make contact on my behalf, and I said yes, because I couldn't imagine calling these strangers and explaining that we shared a grandfather neither of us had fully known, that our fathers were half-brothers who had grown up 8 miles apart without ever meeting, that our family tree had a hidden branch that changed the shape of everything we thought we understood about where we came from. Franklin Morrison called me 2 weeks later, his voice carrying the flattened vowels of East Tennessee, and in the first minute of that conversation, he told me he had always known about the other family, the legitimate family as he called it, because his mother had explained the situation to him and Elizabeth when they were still children, preparing them for a life of secrecy and separation that she presented as necessary rather than shameful. Franklin said his mother had worked as a secretary at the auction house where she'd met my grandfather in 1957, that she'd been a widow whose first husband had died in the Korean War, that she'd fallen in love with a married man who promised her nothing except his presence whenever he could manage it and financial support for the children they would have together. My grandfather had visited the Nash Street house 3 or 4 nights a week, Franklin remembered, arriving after dark and leaving before dawn, maintaining the fiction that he was working late or traveling for business. And during those visits, he had been a father in every practical sense, helping with homework, repairing things around the house, reading bedtime stories in the same voice Franklin now used with his own grandchildren. The arrangement had functioned smoothly until Catherine's death in 1974, Franklin said, and then everything had fallen apart, because my grandfather couldn't acknowledge his second family publicly without destroying his marriage and his standing in a community where respectability meant everything, where a man's reputation could be shattered by the revelation of a secret life maintained for 17 years. After Catherine died, Franklin and Elizabeth had been sent to live with her sister in Wilson County, and my grandfather had continued to send money for their support, but had never visited again, never attended Elizabeth's high school graduation or Franklin's wedding, never met the grandchildren who carried his genetic legacy into another generation. Franklin said he'd stopped hating my grandfather somewhere in his 30s, when his own marriage hit a rough patch, and he began to understand how people could make choices that seemed impossible to explain or justify, but that somehow made sense within the private logic of their own hearts. He said Elizabeth had taken it harder, that she'd changed her surname legally when she turned 18 and had refused to speak about the Morrison side of her family for decades, that even now she wouldn't discuss what had happened or acknowledge any connection to the people in Rocky Mount who shared her blood, but not her history. I asked Franklin if he wanted to meet, if he had any interest in connecting with my father, his half-brother who had grown up on the Leggett Road farm, never knowing that he had siblings living in a house just a few miles away, and Franklin said he'd been waiting for that question for 40 years, but he still didn't know what the answer should be. We met on a Saturday in January at a barbecue restaurant halfway between Rocky Mount and Wilson, a neutral location chosen so neither of us would feel like we were intruding on the other's territory. Franklin Morrison turned out to be a man in his late 60s with my grandfather's build and my father's hands, the same long fingers and broad knuckles, the same way of holding a coffee cup wrapped in both palms as if drawing warmth from it. He brought photograph albums that his mother had kept, Pictures of my grandfather at birthday parties and Christmas mornings. Images of a man I recognized but had never seen in these contexts, smiling and relaxed in ways I associated with my father's childhood photos, but never with the stern figure who had visited our farm on holidays in the 1980s. There were pictures of my grandfather teaching Franklin to ride a bicycle in 1964, helping Elizabeth build a science project in 1970, sitting on the Nash Street porch reading the newspaper while both children played in the yard, and in every image he looked like an ordinary father engaged in the ordinary rituals of family life, except that this family existed in a parallel channel invisible to everyone who knew him in his official capacity. Franklin told me that Catherine had made my grandfather promise to tell his legitimate family the truth someday, that she'd believed the secret would poison everyone it touched if it remained hidden forever, and my grandfather had apparently agreed but had never found the courage or the right moment to honor that promise. After Catherine's death, the whole arrangement had simply collapsed into silence, Franklin said, with everyone involved choosing to act as if those 17 years had never happened, as if the Nash Street house and its inhabitants had been a collective dream that evaporated in the daylight of conventional reality. Franklin had tried once in the late 1980s to contact my father, had written a letter explaining everything and asking if they could meet, but the letter had been returned unopened with a note saying the recipient had moved and left no forwarding address. He'd interpreted that as a sign that my father wanted nothing to do with the revelation, and he'd respected that apparent wish for the next 35 years until the day I'd called him asking questions that made it clear the truth was finally going to emerge whether anyone wanted it to or not. I asked Franklin who had sent me the photograph, the image that had started this entire investigation, and he said it had been his daughter who had found the picture among her grandmother Catherine's belongings and had decided on her own to mail it to me after finding my address through an ancestry website. She'd done it without consulting him, Franklin said, because she believed everyone deserved to know where they came from even if the truth was complicated or painful, and she'd thought that 3 generations of silence was enough burden for any family to carry. I kept returning to the timeline, trying to understand how my grandfather had managed to maintain 2 complete households for nearly 2 decades in a town as small as Rocky Mount, where everyone knew everyone's business. And Franklin explained that in the 1960s, the town's unofficial segregation had worked in my grandfather's favor, that Catherine's house was in a neighborhood where my grandmother would never have gone, where the 2 halves of my grandfather's life existed in separate social spheres that had no reason or opportunity to intersect. The auction house schedule had provided perfect cover during tobacco season, when 14-hour workdays were normal, and no one questioned a man's absence from home as long as the money kept coming in and the bills got paid on time. Franklin said he'd spent years trying to imagine what his mother's life had been like, loving a man who could never fully belong to her, raising children who would never have the social legitimacy that came with their father's public acknowledgement, living in a house that was comfortable and well-maintained but that existed in a kind of legal and emotional limbo. She'd never dated anyone else after my grandfather, Franklin remembered, never showed any interest in remarriage or in finding a partner who could offer her a conventional future, and she died on that highway at 46, having spent the last half of her life waiting for a man who showed up 3 nights a week and disappeared into another family the rest of the time. The car accident itself remained mysterious, Franklin said. A single vehicle crash on a straight stretch of road in good weather. The kind of accident that made people wonder if it had really been an accident at all, or if Catherine had finally reached the end of her capacity to live a life defined by secrecy and limitation. He showed me a letter Catherine had written to my grandfather in 1973, found among her papers after her death, in which she'd asked him directly when he planned to honor his promise to acknowledge their family publicly, and the letter's tone carried a desperation that suggested she was approaching some kind of breaking point after 16 years of living in the shadows of his official life. The envelope containing that letter had never been opened, Franklin said, which meant Catherine had written it, but never sent it, perhaps deciding at the last moment that pushing my grandfather toward a decision would only accelerate the collapse of the arrangement they'd maintained for so long. I asked to read the letter, and Franklin hesitated before handing it over, warning me that its contents would change the way I understood both my grandfather and the woman who had loved him enough to accept whatever limited version of partnership he could offer. Catherine's handwriting was elegant and controlled, the script of someone who had worked as a professional secretary, but the words themselves revealed a woman who had reached the limits of her patience with a situation that had defined her adult life and that promised no resolution except through the passage of more years in the same constrained circumstances. She wrote that she understood the social barriers that prevented my grandfather from leaving his marriage, that she accepted his need to maintain his reputation in a community where scandal could destroy a man's livelihood and standing, but that she needed some assurance that their relationship would eventually move out of the permanent twilight where it had existed since 1958, when she'd first realized she was pregnant with Franklin and had understood that her future would be shaped by loving a man who belonged to someone else. The letter ended with a paragraph that Franklin had underlined in pencil at some point, a passage where Catherine wrote that she sometimes woke in the middle of the night, terrified that my grandfather would die before he acknowledged their children, that Franklin and Elizabeth would spend their lives knowing they had a father who had cared for them in private but had never been willing to claim them in public, and that this half-existence would damage them in ways that might not become apparent until they were adults trying to form their own families and relationships. She asked my grandfather to consider what he was teaching his children about love and commitment and honesty, whether the lessons they were learning in that house on Nash Street would serve them well or haunt them when they had to make their own choices about how to live with integrity in a world that demanded public accountability for private actions. I finished reading the letter and handed it back to Franklin, unable to find words adequate to the weight of what Catherine had written, and Franklin said that his mother had died 8 months after writing those words, her questions unanswered, and her children still living in the limbo she'd described with such clarity and pain. My father refused to speak with Franklin when I first told him about the discovery, said he didn't need to know anything about a family his own father had hidden from him for his entire childhood, that whatever choices his parents had made were their business and their burden, and had nothing to do with his life now. But I could see the knowledge working on him over the following months, could watch him process the implications during long silences that opened up in the middle of ordinary conversations, and eventually he agreed to read the letters I'd copied from Franklin's collection, messages that Catherine had written to my grandfather over the years, and that Franklin had found in a box in her closet after her death. Those letters revealed a woman who had loved deeply but without illusions, who had accepted the constraints of her situation while also documenting her frustration and loneliness, who had wanted her children to know their father, but had also wanted them to understand that his divided loyalties came with a cost that everyone paid in different ways. In one letter from 1971, Catherine had written that she sometimes felt like she was raising my grandfather's children in a house he visited like a guest at a hotel, that he could be warm and present during his hours with them, but that he always left something essential of himself behind when he returned to his other life. I found my grandmother's diary in a trunk in my father's attic, pages she'd written during the same years that Catherine's letters covered, and reading the 2 sets of documents side by side created a strange stereo effect, where the same events and time periods appeared from completely different angles. My grandmother had known something was wrong, had noted my grandfather's increasing absences and emotional distance, had written about her suspicions that he was seeing another woman, but she'd never pushed for confirmation or confrontation, had chosen instead to maintain the appearance of normalcy and let the questions remain unasked and therefore unanswered. In a 1972 entry, she'd written that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, because once they were acknowledged, they would destroy everything they touched, and it was better to live with doubt than with the certainty of betrayal. She died in 2003, without ever admitting to my father that she'd known about the Nash Street house, and I wondered if that silence had been her way of protecting him, or protecting herself, or simply protecting the carefully constructed fiction of family unity that required everyone's cooperation to sustain. My grandmother's diary entries from the months before Catherine's death showed increasing anxiety about my grandfather's behavior, noting that he seemed distracted and distant in ways that went beyond his usual reserve, that he'd started talking about making changes to their living arrangements in vague terms that she couldn't quite decode. She wrote that she'd confronted him once in September 1974, asked him directly if he was planning to leave her, and he'd denied it, but without the conviction she'd hoped to hear. his reassurances feeling hollow and rehearsed like lines from a script he'd memorized but didn't quite believe. The final entry before Catherine's death was dated October 10th, 1974, just 4 days before the accident, and my grandmother wrote that my grandfather had told her he needed to go to Wilson County for a few days on business, a trip that seemed unnecessary and oddly timed given that auction season was over and there was no reason for him to be traveling. She'd let him go without argument, she wrote, because she'd learned over the years that questioning his absences only led to tension and evasion, and she'd decided it was easier to maintain the fiction of trust than to force confrontations that might shatter the fragile equilibrium they'd established. The final piece of the mystery came from Elizabeth Morrison, Franklin's sister, who broke her 30-year silence to send me a single email in March. She wrote that she'd spent most of her adult life trying to forget Rocky Mount and everything associated with it, that she'd changed her name and moved to South Carolina and built a life completely separate from the Morrison family history, but that she wanted me to know one thing before I finished piecing together the story of my grandfather's double life. In October 1974, 3 days before their mother died in that car accident, Elizabeth and Franklin had been told that my grandfather was planning to leave my grandmother and marry Catherine, that he'd finally decided to acknowledge his second family publicly and accept whatever social consequences followed. Catherine had been overjoyed, Elizabeth wrote, had started making plans for a future where they could live openly as a normal family, where my grandfather could attend school events and holiday gatherings without sneaking in through back doors or leaving before other guests arrived. And then Catherine had died on that highway, and my grandfather had retreated into his original family and never spoken of those plans again, and Elizabeth had concluded that the accident was too convenient in its timing to be purely coincidental. Elizabeth didn't explicitly accuse my grandfather of causing Catherine's death, but the implication hung in her email like smoke in a closed room, and I spent weeks trying to decide whether to investigate that possibility or let it remain in the realm of family speculation. The police report from 1974 listed the cause as driver error on a curve that Catherine had driven hundreds of times before. But the report also noted that there had been no witnesses and that the physical evidence was consistent with either an accident or with someone forcing her car off the road. I talked to the investigating officer, now retired and living in a nursing home in Tarboro, and he remembered the case as routine, except for one detail that had bothered him at the time, the fact that Catherine's car had fresh scratches along the passenger side that could have come from contact with another vehicle, but that didn't match anything else found at the scene. He'd written it up as inconclusive, he said, because there was no evidence of foul play and no motive anyone could identify, and the case had been closed within a week as an unfortunate accident that happened sometimes on Carolina highways when drivers got distracted or tired. I tracked down the mechanic who had examined Catherine's car after it was towed from the accident scene, a man named Robert Eccles, who still operated a small garage on the outskirts of Rocky Mount, and who remembered the vehicle because of those unexplained scratches the police officer had mentioned. Robert said the damage pattern suggested another car had sideswiped Catherine's vehicle on the passenger side, pushing it toward the shoulder, and possibly causing her to overcorrect and lose control on the curve. But there had been no paint transfer or other evidence that would have allowed investigators to identify the second vehicle. He'd mentioned this to the investigating officer at the time, Robert said, but without corroborating evidence there was nothing to pursue, and the case had been filed away as one of those accidents where the complete truth would probably never be known. I asked Robert if he remembered anything else unusual about the car, and he thought for a moment before saying that Catherine's purse had been found in the vehicle, but her wallet was missing, a detail that had struck him as odd because robbery didn't seem like a motive for forcing someone off the road. And if she'd been carrying her wallet in her pocket instead of her purse, that would have been unusual for a woman in 1974. The missing wallet led me back to the police report, where I found a notation I'd overlooked on first reading, a brief mention that personal effects had been inventoried and returned to next of kin, but that several items typically carried by the deceased had not been recovered from the vehicle or the accident scene. Among the missing items was Catherine's wallet, which according to Franklin had contained not just her driver's license and a small amount of cash, but also photographs of my grandfather and the children, pictures she'd carried with her everywhere, even though displaying them publicly would have revealed the secret she'd kept for 17 years. I wondered if those photographs had been removed deliberately, either by Catherine herself in the moments before her death or by someone else afterward, and if their absence suggested premeditation or panic, or simply the chaos of an accident scene where small objects could be thrown from a vehicle and lost in the darkness and confusion. I've driven that stretch of Highway 301 a dozen times now, studying the curve where Catherine died, trying to imagine what might have happened in those final moments and whether the truth would change anything about how I understood my grandfather or the choices he made across 60 years of living between two worlds. The curve itself is unremarkable, a gentle bend in a road that runs straight for miles in both directions, the kind of turn that presents no challenge to anyone familiar with the route. And yet this is where Catherine's car left the pavement and struck a tree with enough force to kill her instantly, according to the coroner's report. Franklin says he doesn't want to know if our grandfather was responsible for his mother's death, says that knowledge wouldn't bring Catherine back or repair the damage that was done to all of them when my grandfather chose to maintain his secret life, rather than risk everything on the promise of legitimacy. But I keep returning to that curve, to the scratches on the car, to the missing wallet with its photographs, to the timing of Catherine's death just days after my grandfather had apparently decided to finally acknowledge the family he'd kept hidden for 17 years. And I can't stop wondering if the truth I've uncovered is the complete truth, or just the version that everyone who survived was willing to tell. The last time I saw Franklin was in April, at Pineview Cemetery, where we stood at Catherine's grave and tried to find words adequate to the complexity of what we'd learned about our shared family history. He said that his mother had loved my grandfather despite everything, that she'd gone to her grave believing he would eventually find the courage to live his truth publicly, and that maybe her faith in him had been misplaced, but it had also been real and deserving of respect. I said that my grandfather had died when I was 14, that I remembered him as a distant figure who rarely smiled and who carried himself with the rigidity of someone holding something heavy inside that could never be set down, and that I now understood that weight as the accumulation of decades of secrets and lies and choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but that had hollowed out everyone they touched. We stood there until the afternoon light began to fail, two strangers connected by blood and circumstance, representatives of families that should have grown up together, but that had instead developed in isolation from each other, like plants growing on opposite sides of a wall. Franklin said he'd made peace with the past years ago, had forgiven my grandfather for the abandonment that followed Catherine's death, but that forgiveness hadn't erased the fundamental injustice of growing up as someone's secret child, loved in private but denied in public. And he wasn't sure that wound would ever fully heal, no matter how much time passed or how much understanding he brought to the circumstances that had created it. The White House on Nash Street was torn down in May to make room for a new development, and I went to watch the demolition, saw the walls come apart, and the rooms where Franklin and Elizabeth had grown up with my grandfather collapse into piles of splintered wood and broken plaster. The developer told me the foundation would be salvaged and used as a base for whatever came next. And I thought about how appropriate that seemed, the old structure disappearing while its underlying support remained invisible beneath the surface. Exactly the way family secrets work, when they're buried deep enough that most people forget they exist. I have the photograph still, the image that started all of this, and sometimes I study my grandfather's face in that picture and try to reconcile the man I knew with the man who could maintain two complete families 8 miles apart for 17 years. But the two versions never quite align, no matter how long I look or how much evidence I accumulate. Some mysteries can be investigated and documented and explained in terms of who did what and when, but the deeper mystery of why people make the choices they make, why they're capable of such tenderness in one room and such cruelty in another, remains beyond the reach of documents and interviews and all the tools we use to make sense of the past. The truth I've uncovered has changed nothing about my grandfather's death in 1989 or my grandmother's in 2003, has altered none of the fundamental facts of their lives or the lives they shaped through their choices, but it has split my understanding of family history into before and after, divided my sense of who I am and where I come from along a fault line that runs straight through that photograph of a man standing in front of a house I never knew existed, until a stranger decided that 60 years of silence was enough. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigation into the impossible secrets that families bury in small American towns, where everyone knows the truth, but no one speaks it aloud.